Hello and welcome to the diabetes training for schools and early year settings for the academic year 2020 to 2021. So this is a theory-based session which will be followed by an assessment and a practical session for those staff who will be administering insulin. So by the end of the session, we hope you have a good understanding of the theory of diabetes management, have an awareness of flash glucose monitoring, and understand the requirements required during the COVID-19 pandemic. What is diabetes? So type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition. So this means that the body attacks its own healthy cells in the pancreas, and it is thought to have followed on from a viral illness. The first signs are usually excessive thirst, passing urine more frequently, weight loss, and lethargy. To help understand the physiological process, see this excellent YouTube clip from Diabetes UK. This slide demonstrates what happens to glucose and insulin levels in an individual who does not have diabetes. Now the top graph measures glucose in milligrams per deciliter, which is the American version, whereas we measure it in millimoles per litre. However, the principle still applies. So as you can see, the amount of glucose surge is different at each meal, and this is dependent on the amount of carbohydrate eaten. So at breakfast and supper time, it is slightly higher than at lunchtime, meaning that the carbohydrate content is higher at these meals. The pancreas then senses this and releases the appropriate amount of insulin required. You can also see that there is a natural secretion of insulin at times when we are not eating, so that is in between meals and overnight. What needs to happen to manage diabetes? So children need insulin given either by an injection or an insulin pump in order to maintain their blood glucose levels. This cannot be given as a tablet, unfortunately, as the stomach acids break it down before it being able to be used. Children also need to follow a healthy balanced diet and take regular exercise. We need to aim for blood sugar levels between 4 and 7 before meals, and with their injection sites and cannula sites, these need to be rotated regularly to prevent getting lumps developing under the skin. There are two types of regimes to deliver the insulin, either by multiple daily injections, also known as MDI, where fast-acting insulin is given with every meal and a longer-acting insulin is given at bedtime, or pump therapy, where the insulin is continuously delivered via a pump and extra boluses of insulin are delivered with food. Multiple daily injections, or MDI. So this means usually 4 or 5 injections are given a day, depending on how many meals and snacks the child has. As you can see, the blue line is the fast-acting insulin given with each meal. This is always given before, as it takes 15 minutes to start to work, and then it peaks about 2 hours before being completely metabolized at roughly 4 hours. Therefore, we need another injection with the next meal, and so forth. This is mimicking how the pancreas would normally work. As you can see, the faded beige area demonstrating the normal insulin profile behind. This also shows the insulin secreted from the pancreas at a slower rate when we are not eating, as we always need energy even when we are asleep. Therefore, a slow-acting insulin is given once a day, usually at bedtime, and this is seen with the black line. Pump therapy works in a similar way, but doses are given in much smaller increments, so it can be a lot more accurate. Pump therapy uses just a fast-acting insulin, which is delivered continuously each hour. This allows for much more accurate insulin profiles being administered to suit the specific age of the child. Research has shown that more insulin is required in the early hours of the morning and the early evening as a background, which is easily addressed by the pump, as we can see here to the bottom right. This background insulin, also known as the basal insulin, is instead of that long-acting once-a-day injection given on the MDI regime. Then the same principle applies as with the injections, where a bolus of insulin is required when eating. This is delivered by the pump and is calculated depending on the blood sugar and the carbohydrates to be eaten. Pumps can be either with a tube or without. As I've mentioned previously, insulin is required for all snacks that contain carbohydrates. For those on injections, it will mean an extra injection at break time as well as lunchtime, and for those on pumps, it will just be the same process where you're using the handset to deliver insulin. With the meters, the blood glucose level and carbohydrates are entered into the meter, and the dose of insulin is advised just like the meal time. Blood glucose testing is extremely important and essential for good control of diabetes. These are the times when blood glucose testing is required during the school day. So before meals and snacks, it's really important that we know the blood sugar is above 4 before we're delivering insulin. Before, during and after activity. During the activity, this depends on the length of activity. If it's longer than an hour, we will need to test halfway through. If we are suspecting a low or high blood glucose level, and if the child is feeling unwell or showing any signs of hypoglycemia. Always confirm with a test, as the treatment for hypoglycemia is very different to hyperglycemia. So what can go wrong? Hypoglycemia is a blood glucose level that is too low, anything that is less than 4. And to help you remember this, we say 4 is the floor. Children may refer to a hypoglycemia as a hypo or a low. The opposite to this is a hyperglycemia, when the blood glucose level is too high, so anything above 10 millimoles. Signs of hypoglycemia. So these can be a variety of signs, and each child may display one symptom or 2 or 3 of the symptoms. You will become familiar with how this child will present when they're hypo. So they could feel really hungry, they may become really quiet, they may have sunken eyes, they may feel quite dizzy, or they may tell you they have wobbly legs depending on the age of the child. They may become really pale, particularly around the area around the mouth. They may become really sweaty or have quite a clammy forehead. They may feel shaky. They may appear uncoordinated, bad-tempered, or they may feel pins and needles in their hands, or just generally tired. Hypoglycemia can come on very quickly. So the causes of hypoglycemia are too much insulin, too little food. So, for example, if the child hasn't eaten all of their food that we were expecting them to eat and they've had the insulin for it. Stress can cause a hypoglycemia. Unplanned exercise if they haven't had a snack. Hot weather, as you absorb the insulin much more easily during hot weather, and an illness such as a vomiting bug. So the treatment for hypoglycemia can be a selection of anything that contains fast-acting sugar. So here are some suggestions. 3 to 5 glucose tablets, 110 ml of original Lucozade, 100 ml of fruit juice, half a can of diet pop, or a tube of glucogel, which you can see here at the bottom right hand corner. The child will have a preference, and it will be noted in their care plan. They should keep a stock within school and also carry supplies on them. Once they have had this fast-acting glucose, they need to wait to 15 minutes and retest. It's really important that they wash their hands again, as they might have some sugar on their fingertips. If the blood glucose at this 15-minute mark is not above 4, then this treatment needs to be repeated. You can see a flowchart of this in the information booklet supplied. So after 15 minutes, the follow-up treatment differs depending on whether the child is on injections or on an insulin pump. So for those on injections, if the hypo has happened not at a meal time, then a small snack containing 10 to 15 grams of carbohydrate is required. So for example, a biscuit or a piece of fruit. If the hypo has happened just before lunch, then once the blood sugar is above 4 at the 15-minute mark, the child can continue with their lunch, but they must have their insulin with it as they normally would. Otherwise, the glucose will spike later on. A child on an insulin pump does not need a snack. However, hypos make them extremely hungry. So if they do want to eat something, then that is fine, but they need to give insulin with it. It's really important that insulin is never missed at meal times, even if the child has been low previously. Glucogel is used when the child is unable to manage glucose tablets or a drink because their glucose level is too low. They may become disorientated and will not cooperate with you. A small amount of this gel will be rubbed into the inside of their cheek, and if you rub on the outside, this will encourage absorption. They will need the whole tube, so just do this a little bit at a time. Some of it will be swallowed and some will be absorbed through the lining of the cheeks or gums. Do not give glucogel or anything via their mouth if they are unresponsive or unconscious, as they may choke. Call 999 and state that the child has type 1 diabetes. What to do if the child is unconscious or having a seizure? Call 999 straight away, and a member of staff who has received this training can administer glucagon. This is the emergency hypo kit that is in the orange box, which is usually kept in the fridge. The link below is a YouTube video of how to administer this. Glucagon is a hormone that kickstarts the liver to release glucose into the bloodstream. This orange box is stored in the fridge usually, and the expiry date is around 3 years, which is written on the box. However, it can be kept at room temperature. It just halves the expiry date, so it's important to write this on the box. So if a child is going on a residential, or the child prefers to keep it in their bag, then that is okay. However, I recommend keeping it in a fridge at school so then staff know where this emergency kit is. The contents need to be mixed and instructions are inside the box, and you've just seen that YouTube video to show you how it's done. Children over 8 years old need all of the mixed content, and children under 8 years old need half of the mixed content. This is also written in the healthcare plan for each child. It is injected into the thigh or buttock, and the child must lie in the recovery position when this is being given. Now moving on to the other end of the scale, hyperglycemia, which is a blood glucose level anything above 10 millimoles. So signs of hyperglycemia include being thirsty, needing to go to the toilet more frequently, feeling sick, looking flushed in the face, having stomachache, having a headache because of dehydration, and a very late sign of labour. Causes of hyperglycemia include too little or no insulin at all, too much carbohydrate, so if they've not accounted for an extra snack or a pudding, for example, if they are unwell with the temperature. Stress can also cause high blood sugars as well as low blood sugars we previously mentioned, so exam time, for example, children may experience more erratic blood glucose levels. Hormones as well can cause hyperglycemia, and you often find that adolescents require almost double the amount of insulin during this time. If they are taking less exercise than usual, and for those children who are on insulin pumps, they could have a blocked cannula or air in the tubing. It's really important to treat hyperglycemia. These children have diabetes, which is a lifelong condition. Hyperglycemia can cause complications later on in life. So we are always acting on high blood glucose levels. Every time we do a blood glucose test, the meter, or the insulin pump, will calculate an extra dose of insulin if the blood sugar is out of range. This extra dose of insulin is known as the correction dose, and it can be given with food or on its own. So what action do we take? If the child is feeling well, but they have a high glucose level, then we just need to deliver a correction dose and then allow the child to return back to class. This correction dose can take up to 2 hours to work. They may be feeling thirsty, so allowing to have water is fine, and they may need to go to the toilet more frequently, so again allow for this. If they are feeling unwell with a high glucose level, then they must rest, and we do not encourage activity. If the symptoms continue, then contact the parents. They may need their ketones checking, and more insulin may be needed. And if the child starts to be physically sick, then do call for advice straight away. So I have just mentioned ketones there. Ketones are an acid produced when the fat is used instead if there is not enough insulin in the body to utilise the glucose present. This could be due to illness, as the body requires more energy and hormones are released that can cause insulin resistance, or it can be due to missed insulin. If it's left undetected and untreated, a serious condition called diabetic ketoacidosis can develop. Testing ketones is very much like testing a blood glucose level, just using a different meter, the one on this screen. It is important to test ketones when the child is feeling unwell with a high glucose level and inform the parents or the diabetes team of the result. We very much encourage exercise for all children, even with type 1 diabetes. Yes, exercise will affect their blood glucose level, but it shouldn't stop them from doing the activity. We just need to be prepared. So there are two types of exercise that will affect the glucose in different ways. Anaerobic activity, that is short, sharp bursts of activity, so that is sprinting or weightlifting, will actually increase the blood glucose level. Aerobic activity, so that's longer endurance exercise, which is swimming, jogging or dancing for example, will actually decrease the blood glucose level. However, most children at school take part in team games such as football, hockey, netball and tennis, where actually 1 minute you're standing around, the next you're sprinting for the ball. So actually that will involve both anaerobic and aerobic, and the blood glucose can go up or down. So because of this, there are some simple steps to follow, and bearing in mind each child can vary in the amount of effort that they put into the activity. So we always need to test their blood glucose level before the exercise to ensure that it's reading 7 or above. If it is under 7, then they need a small snack. After the exercise, we also advise to check the glucose level to ensure it's not too low. And if they are too high, then we do not advise a correction, as they will be much more sensitive to insulin after exercise. We always advise that the child has their meter easily accessible, whether the PE teacher looks after the meter or the meter is on the side of the pitch, and this also includes hypo treatment. The child must not walk back to the changing rooms on their own when they are having a hypo, as the hypo could worsen very quickly. We review blood glucose levels with the families regularly, and if we notice any patterns, for example, if they are having low blood glucose levels after PE on a particular day, then we will put plans in place to deal with their insulin to try and prevent this from happening. We very much encourage exercise and we want them to continue and enjoy it and not suffer hypos as a result. Moving on to advances in technology, so something called flash glucose monitoring. This device is also known as the Libra, and it is worn on the back of the arm and it reads the glucose level in the interstitial fluid every 5 minutes. This reading is usually 5 to 10 minutes behind a blood glucose reading, so it's important to take that into account, and I'll discuss that in the next slide. This is now available on prescription to children who meet certain criteria, so more and more of our patients will have access to this. This slide demonstrates the difference between flash glucose monitoring and the usual classic finger prick testing. So on the left hand side you can see the finger prick test, selecting the sample from the capillary, and on the right hand side is the sensor which sits just underneath the skin. Now the blue dots are the glucose molecules, and as you can see they travel from the capillary into the interstitial fluid. So this is the reason why there may be a difference between the blood glucose reading and the interstitial fluid reading. To help explain the difference between the blood glucose reading taken from the finger prick sample to the interstitial fluid reading taken from the scan of the sensor, we are using the idea of a roller coaster. So the red cart here is the blood glucose reading and the yellow cart is the reading taken from the scan. So when the glucose levels are stable, the red cart and the yellow cart should be measuring very similar readings. However, when the glucose level is changing rapidly, so this is after food and insulin, the blood glucose may be reading higher than the interstitial fluid reading. So if you remember from the previous slide, glucose travels from the blood into the tissues, so that explains that. And on the same on the way down. This is the lag time, so it's really important to take this into account, because if a child is telling you they're feeling hypo but the sensor is only reading a 5.5, they could already be hypo because of this lag time. So using this sensor, it's supporting and giving you extra information, but it doesn't take away blood glucose testing completely. There are still some really important times when we need to do a finger prick test, and that is when the child is having insulin, or they are feeling hypo, or they have really high blood glucose levels. So this is what the reader will look like once you've done a scan from the sensor. You have a number there, which is the reading from the interstitial fluid, which we've just talked about. You will have a graph at the bottom, which is showing you sort of the last 8 to 12 hours of glucose readings. And you will also have an arrow. Now the arrow is extremely useful because it's telling you where the glucose is travelling in the next 10 to 15 minutes, and it's quite self-explanatory. On the left here it tells you what the arrow means. So a vertical up arrow means it's rising quickly, the diagonal up arrow means it's rising slowly, a horizontal arrow means it's changing slowly, and then vice versa. So you've got a downward diagonal arrow, it's falling, and then a vertical diagonal arrow, it's falling quickly. Here are some really useful times when the arrows will be helpful. So exercise, for example. Scan before the exercise and use the arrow to determine whether a snack is needed. So for example, if you scan and the reader is saying 6.5 but with an up arrow, you will know that in 10 minutes time that reading will be well above 7. So they'll be fine to do the activity without a snack. You can scan as many times as you want during the activity and after, so it's giving you a lot more insight in how the exercise affects the glucose levels. Also in between meals, particularly for younger children, if you're concerned that the glucose level may drop in between. And also scanning at meal times gives you an indication of sort of how accurate that the reader is in comparison to the blood glucose test. There are times when we can't rely on it, so when we need to give insulin, we always need to do a test at the same time because of that lag time, and if we're giving a correction dose, we need an accurate result to do that from. When the child is feeling low, and when the sensor is indicating low because of the lag time, they might be much lower than the reader is actually telling us, and when the child is feeling high and generally unwell, we just need to revert back to the gold standard of finger prick testing. So that comes to the end of the theory aspect of managing diabetes in schools. I'm now going to talk about COVID-19 and the legal aspects. So children with type 1 diabetes do not need to be shielded unless they are vulnerable due to other conditions. They can attend school as long as the following criteria is available. So they must have a trained member of staff present. Staff must be wearing PPE when they are required to perform diabetes tasks such as blood glucose testing, administering insulin, treating a hypo, for example, and social distancing must be maintained and hygiene measures. And of course, if any child develops COVID-19 symptoms, then they must self-isolate like anybody else. Below is a link for the British Society Paediatric Endocrinology and Diabetes, which have provided a position statement for schools for children with diabetes returning during the COVID-19 pandemic. This will provide you with some reassurance, but please do not hesitate to contact the team for further information or any advice. This comes to the end of the presentation. We very much thank you for your time. We hope you have found it comprehensive and have gained an understanding of managing diabetes in schools. We now ask you to complete an assessment provided to ensure the diabetes team and yourselves have gained satisfactory understanding of the theoretical aspects of caring for children with diabetes. This will be marked and returned to you. We aim for a pass mark of 90% in order for you to achieve your certificate, so please return the assessment to this email here. This session will then be followed by a practical session for those members of staff who will be performing diabetes tasks, and we will inform you of these dates when they are available. Thank you again for your time. Please do not hesitate to contact us for any queries or further information.